Welcome everybody to Read, Write, Local, Unbound, a special presentation of Avon Lake Public Library, where every Tuesday evening during the summer of 2021, we talk to a different author, a different writer. All these are going to be archived on YouTube for future reference, so that's what you're probably watching right now if you weren't here. And this Tuesday, July the 13th, I'd like to welcome our special guest, Kelly Boyer Sagert. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right. What I'd like to talk about the authors here, because it's not just you're talking about what you write, but also how you write it and why you write it. So I know you've got a really interesting backstory about how you came to be a writer, and you just have a backstory period that's interesting about your family. Let's talk about the funeral home.
The funeral home. Yeah. So I'm a pretty obsessive reader, like obsessive. And sometimes people ask me why they think I'm like that. And honestly, it's hard for me to tease out what I would have been like had I not lived in the funeral home. So when I was 3 months old, we moved into a funeral home. My father had just gotten his mortuary license, and the city of Lorain offered them free rent if we lived there. And they were, had been poor college students, and free rent sounded great. So we moved above the funeral home, and I had to be quiet all the time. So my mom always would hand me a book and say, "Hey, why don't you sit down and read? Wouldn't that be fun?" And I don't know, then looking back, would I have thought it was fun if that wasn't what I did all the time? I guess I don't know the answer. We couldn't cook things that smelled bad because it could go down, walk down the steps because we were on the top floor. So, no fish, no cabbage. Couldn't flush toilets during business hours because it was an old building and the pipes would do the loud whoosh and everything. So it was an interesting way to grow up. And then after just a few years, my parents realized, after they had my sister, they realized that might be a little too much. But all we did was move next door and wire the doorbell and the phone into that house. And basically our backyard was part of the parking lot, abutted right to the parking lot. So my entire life, I grew up there.
So that's probably why you're not a musician. You couldn't really practice so much of that. Before headphones became really popular, yes.
That's true. That's true.
So you began reading at quite a high level pretty early on. You were telling me a story also about how your first encounter with the libraries, where it kind of really opened up your world. Actually, hold on. Before that, let's talk about your grandma and Agatha Christie.
Yeah, so my grandma actually got a degree in English literature in 1929, which, if I understand correctly, there weren't a lot of women doing things like that. She was an obsessive reader. And so that was something we connected about. And after just a few years, I'm still in elementary school, she realized, because I read all the time and I started so young, that I needed some better material than Go Dog Go and, all that sort of thing. So she suggested Agatha Christie. And of course, when I came to the Lorain Public Library, I was 10 at that time, and you had to be 12 to get a grown-up library card. So my dad went there and explained, that I really needed to have a little more challenging material. And so there was a librarian. I still remember her, Nancy, and we sat down and talked about how I really needed Agatha Christie. And she told me that she could tell I wasn't trying to get to the adult side to read all the stuff that, kids weren't allowed to read about. She could tell I really just wanted to read. So I checked out every Agatha Christie book that I could, read them all. Didn't even realize, I thought Agatha Christie was the mystery writer. And after I was finished, Nancy Hanks said to me, "Why don't you just pick another mystery writer?" And I remember thinking there are more mystery writers, like there's 2 or 3 or 5. So I went to Perry Mason next, although I don't remember why, but I did. So I read all the Perry Mason books that I could, and I just kept going. And still to this day, just about every day of my life, I read part of a mystery novel.
So that must be a lot of mystery books over the
Oh my gosh,
that you've gone through.
So many.
And there's so many new ones coming out all the time. And some of these series now have gone on to 40 books and so on. So yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's just really interesting that you had that entree into that. And now sometimes when we come to reading and writing, we see this part of the world. We don't realize, oh my God, why didn't they tell me what the rest of it?
Pretty much what happened.
Now, as far as the writing thing, I know I love hearing from a lot of the writers their first book, which was usually, I think in your case it was sixth grade or something.
Well,
Or
it was a play.
it
My
was a
first
play
play
that you wrote.
script.
Yes. Mhm.
Yes. And actually, I remembered the title. It was The Haunted House Mystery, and it really was bad. I mean, exceptionally bad.
Scooby-Doo inspired, right?
It was completely Scooby-Doo inspired. Instead of Velma, I used my neighbor Kathy, and instead of using, Freddie, I used my neighbor Mikey, and I pretty much just, yeah, I plagiarized completely, but it was actually something I completed, and I can remember my sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Goldberg, saying to me, "You actually finished this. There's an actual finished script," and I'm like, "Yeah," and she read it and was very encouraging. So, and I used to read. This is terrible. In fourth, fifth grade, sixth grade, I was already reading books and then creating quizzes for my friends to take. And sometimes they would indulge me once or twice, but nobody wanted to do the hundreds of quizzes that I thought they should do.
So
yeah,
you invented AR.
oh yeah. Oh, I was doing that in like 1970. I was already doing that.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got good feedback from your teachers, and you had great mentors with the librarian, and of course your grandma, who I think you
Yeah.
told me would always present a book to you as, wow, I just got this. I'm sharing this with
Oh
you.
yeah.
It is really special. So
Oh yeah.
yeah.
And my grandparents, they would always, "Oh, you're not going to believe what came out. You're so lucky. What perfect timing." And then I just, "Oh yeah, this is great." And, so like I said, I don't know if I would have, if I would have been like this anyhow, or if it's just because that's the way my life directed me. I guess I don't know, but I love it.
Now, going on through your, as you grew up, you mentioned that writing wasn't something that really occurred to you as a career or anything like that. But you went to college, and then things took several different turns.
They took lots of turns. So I was 15 and I took an aptitude test like everybody else in high school. And my counselor called me and said, "I'm so excited. I've never seen anyone score so highly on one specific thing." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Journalism." And I said, "Absolutely not. I'm not going to write for a living. That would be like having homework assignments every day the rest of my life. When I'm done with school, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know it's not that." Tried to get me to change my mind, and I stood firm. And then I went home, told my parents, and I can remember my dad laughing, saying, "Well, mine read funeral director." And that was, the class joke. I told him I would never be a funeral director. He went off,
So
got
it
a
goes.
marketing degree, married my mom. Unbeknownst to them, she was pregnant with me. But he came home and said, "I really want to be a funeral director." So he went off to mortuary school in Pittsburgh, left my mom behind in Akron. She was a kindergarten teacher. They didn't want her to teach because she was pregnant, and that wasn't something that was the best idea back then. And so, yeah, so they had no income. They had me coming. And so then what he said is, "Listen, you don't want to make the same mistakes I did. Why don't you listen to your teacher?" And I said no. So I went off to Bowling Green. I got a bachelor's in psychology, minor in communications. And my English teacher said, "Have you ever thought about the creative writing program?" And what I said to her is, "We've already discussed it and we agreed it's not the right thing to do," even though we was really me.
Mhm.
And it was not until I was 29 that it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was pregnant with my first son. And I thought, my gosh, I would love to be a writer for a living. And when my husband came home from work that day, he said, "Well, how do you do that?" And I said, "I have no idea. Anyone who's ever tried to help me, I shut them off and wouldn't listen to them. So I have no idea." So I
So
pretty
you
much had to
ran and
start.
ran and ran, but you couldn't hide. Now
I
it's
guess
time.
so. I
Hmm.
guess so. And once I knew that's what I wanted to do, that was what, 31 years ago. I have never changed my mind for a moment. It just took me a little while to get there.
Now, you said that your first story was for a cat magazine, or was it just called Cat Magazine?
It's called Cats Magazine.
Cats. Okay.
There you go. Yeah. So when I finally decided I was going to write for a living, I did take one course that you did by mail that to teach you how to target your writing towards your audience. That's really what it was about. And that was really helpful because that stuck with me. And that was the one thing I think that may have really pushed me ahead, maybe, of some people who didn't know that. This was pre-internet. You couldn't look on the internet and find out how to be a writer. You couldn't look up writer's guidelines. It was all by mail. Um, and so then I thought about when we had a cat move into our family funeral home. And it was, first of all, there's a lot of humorous things that happen. But then I think what might have been the hook of the story that got their attention is that my father, of course, we're not keeping the cat, not keeping the cat. And then he was picked as the Lorain Rotary president. The Morning Journal came, took a picture of him, called him and said, who was in that picture with you? And he started to say, no one. And then he said, is it a really scroungy looking alley cat? And the reporter said, it is. And my father said, that's Mr. Gray. He's an employee of the funeral home. And they printed something like that as a caption. So these people started saying to my dad, I didn't know you had a cat. I didn't know the funeral home had a cat. So he looked at me and he looked at my sister and said, if you're going to keep that scroungy cat, you better take it to the vet and get it some shots. So we did. And we kept him, and he was a great cat. And so I wrote the story of how, he worked his way. And like I said, that was one of many things that this cat did to get into the funeral home, actually to our house, but he originally tried to move into the funeral home. So anyhow, so that was my first one. I got paid $35. It appeared in print in December 1991. And then if I thought I was hooked before, I was super hooked when I realized, hey, I could actually get something in print, and I actually got some money.
Okay, so then this is sometimes it's not as big a thing anymore, I think, as it was 30 years ago, magazines, because, well, there aren't as many magazines anymore, or they're probably paying even less inflation adjusted these days for stories. But that then led to another magazine story, right?
Yeah, it took me another year to get a second one accepted. And that was the point where my husband said, because he'd been really supportive. By that time I was probably pregnant with our second son. We didn't have a real huge income. And he was being supportive and saying, this is really what you want to do, let's do it. But after 2 years, he said, I don't want to be discouraging, but you made $35 the first year, $25 the second, add them together, divide by 2. You're making $30 annually before taxes. This isn't sustainable. So at that point, I contacted the Morning Journal, and they had me take a little test and decided I could write about their school board meetings and the council meetings. Basically, I wrote about things nobody else wanted to write about. I wrote about mud ordinances. If someone puts mud on the roads, are they legally obligated to remove the mud? Should water towers be taken out of viable water systems, or should they be kept up for navigation purposes? Those are not the things, trained journalists were lining up to write about.
But nevertheless,
Again,
councils are talking about that stuff endlessly, and
exactly.
The community wants to know.
Exactly. So that's what I did. And then ultimately from that, for a couple of years, I turned everything in on time. I really didn't complain about it because once I wanted to do it, I wanted to do it. And so they called me and said, would you like to do this big Sunday splash, blah, 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 the whole page? I said, sure. They said, it's going to be about a Lorain County resident. It's going to be colorful with all these images and all this stuff. And I said, great, what's the topic? And the editor looked at me and said, listen, if you're really going to be a writer, you're going to tell me, I'm not going to tell you. And I completely froze, told my husband my life was over, my career was over. Why did I ever think I knew how to do this? And so the editor gave me a week to come up with something. It was the day before. I still had not come up with anything that fit these parameters. And so someone I knew, Sharon Smucker, saw me the night before and said, you're always so cheerful and you look so, sad. What's wrong? And I told her my life was ruined. My life was over. My career was over. And I told her why. And she goes, well, just call Gary Broadbent. Here's his phone number. Well, of course, he was an international boomerang champion who owned the world's largest boomerang collection. At that time, it was more than 10,000. We have remained friends for 30 years, which is kind of crazy. I just sent me a message not too long ago. And so then I ended up writing about him. It was extremely colorful. I mean, his house is full of boomerang art. One looks like Michael Jordan dunking a basketball, but it's a returning boomerang. Another one looks like the Ninja Turtles, every letter of the alphabet. So it was really great visually, and it was a great story. And a month after that, Gary called me and said, hey, a friend of mine who lives in Avon just set a world record, kept a boomerang in the air for 17 minutes, 6 seconds. Do you think your editor would want that? So of course they did. And from that, I got an offer for my first book, which was about boomerangs, America's silent sport, because I was one of the few people in the country who was writing about boomerang competition.
Well, that's quite an opportunity. You made yourself into a boomerang expert and the authority, and the book comes right out of that. Your first one. So how'd that do your book? How was this? What publisher was involved and everything? How'd that all work for you?
This was the smallest press publisher. The owner is since died, so it's no longer a publishing company. But he did a really good job. Printed 3,000 hardback copies. Again, this was different. There was no internet, so it was a very different world where the internet was just starting, because this would have been right when the AOL was just being invented.
Like
But what was
early
really
mid 90s.
yes, that's
Hmm.
what it was. And what was really cool was boomerang throwers all around the world bought it and would use it almost like a yearbook. So if they would go to an international boomerang tournament, if their picture was in it, they'd sign, next to it. Or so there's all these books that have all this boomerang history now written into it, because they would write notes to one another, and people have archived them. So numbers, small in the, couple thousand, but it made a big impact on the boomerang world. And still to this day, I found out I am the only female to have written a boomerang book.
Yes, and you early on created some sort of social media on paper because it went around the world. It took a bit
It did.
longer, but
It
people
did.
interacted with it and
It
made
did.
it into something bigger than it was. You're a genius.
Well, unintentionally, but it worked.
And then there were more books. I remember you were telling me about the first 3 books you wrote, and of course my notes are very bad. So, but I remember the Boomerang. So,
Yeah, so the Boomerang book, and after that, the Lorain Public Library contacted me and wanted to do an in-house book about their history, all the way from the founding through, I believe, the Toni Morrison Reading Room. And it might not even have been it wasn't the reading room maybe yet. It was being planned something. So I wrote a book called Birth of Illumination that's only in the Lorain Public Library system. What I had done since then, I quickly learned that some of the things I would want to write were what I call academic light. They're not actual textbooks. They're not heavy duty academic books. And yet they're more, I don't know, informative and whatever. I'm not writing romances and all those sorts of things.
but
And
there's
so I
research
really,
involved. There's experience you're putting onto
yes,
the pages. Yes.
yes. And one of the problems with that is they would say, you only have a bachelor's degree. And I would say, yes, I only have a bachelor's degree. And through the Boomerang book, actually, I came up with this. Well, I didn't come up with a solution. A solution was given to me, and that led to my third book and many books after that. What happened was a New York publisher, and I believe it was Macmillan or Scribner. Macmillan came first, I think, or maybe even Berkshire. I don't know. But these big New York publishing houses, they still do encyclopedias, but they do them thematically. It's not A, B, C, D. It's Native American athletes, or whatever it might happen to be. And somebody came up with the idea to do an encyclopedia about women in sports all around the world, and they wanted to get every kind of quirky sport imaginable. And so one of those was boomerang throwing, because there were at that time a couple women who would compete with the guys. And so apparently they contacted the world boomerang champion at the time, lived in Delaware, Ohio, and he said, I'm not the one to write it, but I have a friend I met through this book named Kelly. You ought to contact him. Well, apparently that didn't resonate with them quite yet. So they contacted another man who has a private boomerang museum in Michigan, and he also would teach. He's an engineer, and he would teach boomerang physics in the Notre Dame physics program. They asked him to write it, and he said, that's just not really my thing, but I got this friend named Kelly. And then they contacted Gary Broadbent, who was the original guy that I'd done the newspaper story with because of all his boomerang records and because he had the world's largest boomerang collection. And he said, I don't do this, but, and they said to them, Tim, if you're going to tell me about a friend named Kelly, obviously we're going to call her, what's her phone number? So I got this phone call from New York. Would you write about boomerangs for publication? And I did. And shortly after that, they said, is there any chance you write about ice skating and track? And what I said to them, because I never want to say something that's dishonest, but I also don't want to close the door. So I said, I would gladly do that. That felt honest. So then they gave me some more. And what I realized was that people respected you in a whole different way once you'd written for encyclopedias. Shortly after that, I believe was Scribner's next. I got a call from them and they said, we would like to write a competing publication from whatever the first one was. Would you write for us? And I said, sure. And they said, do you write about women's basketball? And again, I said, well, I certainly could. And suddenly I became this, not only this sports writer, quite unintentionally, I also became an encyclopedia writer. And as I was doing research for another encyclopedia about Native Americans in sport, I ran across an ad from Greenwood Publishing that said they were looking for someone who wrote about sports, and they wanted someone with somewhat of an academic background. And so I wrote to them because I saw they wanted Shoeless Joe Jackson, a biography of Shoeless Joe Jackson. And I explained to them that I did not have an advanced degree, but boy, was I pretty experienced in encyclopedia writing. And they're like, sold. You write for encyclopedias, you can write press. So then I wrote several books for them, which was kind of a long way of saying that was my next entry into that kind of book writing.
And that sort of audience, that's sort of the audience basically for these books is pretty much libraries, right, in schools.
Yes, correct.
So they're specialized books. They're for reference. They're for reading. They're for education.
Yes.
And that's quite a different world, I think, that a lot of people are used to. But it's also a world that got you into a lot of things, and it even helped you help a friend out, right?
Yeah. So then Wayne Stewart, I know at least one person here knows Wayne Stewart. Well, a couple of you I know at least know. He had taught one of my boys at Lorain Community College, Kids for College, in the writing program, and he and I just kind of got to know one another because I would drop my kid off and we'd talk. And my editor of Shoeless Joe Jackson book said, do you know anybody who likes to write about sports who might do Babe Ruth? The guy who signed up for Babe Ruth never turned in his manuscript. So I got a hold of Wayne and I said, hey, you want to call my editor Greenwood? And he did. And then I think Wayne's published quite a few books with them.
About 30.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. There you go. So yeah, that's how that happened.
Yes. Writers helping writers, which has been happening for a long time in our area and others. And what I was hoping that maybe a few people will see some of these shows or be here and that connection will be made. That's my fondest hope.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, then the other thing I noticed that you've got into, besides some of these semi-academic books, is you've been a ghostwriter and memoir writer. Of course, you can't talk much about which ones, but
Yes.
that you have been doing this for people. What are some of the challenges with that?
Oh gosh. So I ghostwrite memoirs for people. I've actually done about a dozen during this whole COVID year or two, because I've been basically home, and we were able to do a lot of it through Zoom. And they're usually about 20,000 words in length, so they're not super long memoirs. And then there's lots of pictures. Some of the challenges. Occasionally, I think some people want their memoirs written because it's almost like a form of therapy. And then it never goes, I mean, they're happy with the book, but I don't think it solves their original problem. Sometimes it's because they are famous in their certain area of expertise. Again, can't mention any names, but I ended up writing one for an architect. And if I were to mention all the buildings that he designed, in the architect world, he's very well known. I'm in the middle of doing one for a woman who played Olympic sports. So usually there's something they've done, or it can be something, a life experience. Like I did a couple's memoir last year, and one of them escaped from Romania during communism. The other one escaped from Hungary, and they met in New England and quickly fell in love. And it was sort of their story of their two communism stories and how they came together and made a life together in the United States. I love doing it. A lot of times people will start out saying, well, there's really nothing interesting in my life. Then I start talking to them and I'm like, seriously, think of what you just said. I think they're so sort of like me sometimes with the funeral home or something. Sometimes your life is so normal to you that you're surprised when someone else is surprised.
Yeah. I mean, apparently libraries are interesting to some people as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I found out.
Definitely.
But you're talking about doing the memoirs and things. Are these where the people themselves are coming to you and going independent, or is there publishers working with the authors, bringing everybody together, kind of like a impresario sort of thing? Like what sort of audience are they being made for? You said sometimes they're specialists, like famous architect, famous athlete in a special area. And like how do these things happen?
Well, there are publishing companies that are specifically, if someone searches on the internet, there are companies now that will do memoir books. And they will get writers like me, and If someone contacts them and says, "Hey, I would love to, have my memoir done," a lot of times it's a grown child who's maybe done well financially and wants their parents' story to be told. That seems to be pretty common.
Hmm.
And then what will happen is if they end up working with a certain publisher, they will recommend some writers that they work with. And it tends to be, if people have a really interesting life as far as history, sometimes military experience, sports, they often, if I'm on their list of their roster, um, they'll often recommend me. And then sometimes I will meet with them. Used to be in person if they lived within 2 hours of me. Pre-COVID, I would drive there. Now everything we're doing in Zoom, and I'm kind of thinking I would like it to stay that way, but we'll see what the world does. It's not entirely up to me. And so we would chit chat, and usually by the time it gets to that point, they'll go with the publisher's recommendation. I mean, I don't think I usually do something that will, so turn them off or make them think, oh, not her, kind of thing. So usually by that point, if they're interested in doing it and I've been recommended, then we come up with a plan. We do interviews that I record, and then I write a draft. Once they approve the draft, then the publisher gets that, gets the pictures, and then they take it from there.
So are you often interviewing more than just the subjects of the book, other people involved? You're putting a lot of things together, yes?
Sometimes, especially, so for example, the architect. I talk to a lot of people who design buildings for. I talk to some family members. With people who escaped from communism, I talk to their children. So sometimes, and then other times, I will do some research on the side because it's funny how people, again, when they live something, they don't always think to tell you everything behind the scenes. So they might reference a certain event in history, and I'm thinking, what the heck are they even talking about? So sometimes I need to read a book or read some material and then say, oh, so you're talking about the couple, who had been in Hungary. They would say something, and I would go, and actually their accents were both really still strong. They speak English well, but man, they never lost those accents. So sometimes I would kind of take what they'd say, and in between our calls, I'd do some independent reading. And then I would say, oh, so you're talking about when Russia did the following. Or now you're talking about after the Nazis had left, but, and then they'd be, oh, yeah. So sometimes I have to do some things on the side to give myself some context.
You're digging some tunnels in two directions because they're not sure in their audience who understands everything. And you're certainly knowing, I have no idea what that is.
Exactly.
And you can't make them too specialized. There has to be, otherwise you're writing it for one group. This is something that anybody should be able to pick up and read and know exactly what's going on.
Yes.
Here's further reading if you're interested, but not like,
yes.
What?
Yes. And sometimes people just intend it for their family. Sometimes a family member will say, when mom passes, all this family history is going to be gone. So some of them are clear that they don't necessarily want this huge audience. But other ones do want a bigger audience, and obviously the bigger audience you want, the more context, outside context you have to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I know those are some of the challenges and the things you run into writing those books. You've also written some history books, and like I see the Lorain County, the history book you've done, and that's with the History Press, which is kind of all connected to Arcadia.
Yep.
And so what was that? I mean, they have a formula, but you still have some certain freedom to color within that, right?
Yeah, and it was interesting because they contacted the Lorain Public Library and said, connect us to a history writer. And so the library gave them my information. And originally, I don't even think I can say what it is. They had this original idea about a very specific part of history of our area. And they asked me if I would write a proposal if I was interested in writing this book. I write the proposal, and then they decided it didn't have a wide enough audience, and they wouldn't make enough money, even though it was originally, their idea. I guess with some reflection, they decided it wasn't. They said, what's that?
Back and forth. People are figuring out what is they really want. Yep.
Yep. So they said, could you do something broader? Could you do it about the whole history of the city of Lorain? So I did a proposal, and they said, we think that's too narrow, even though it was broader than the original idea. They said, can you give us another one? So I did one of Lorain and Oberlin, the two different histories, compare, contrast. Well, they thought it was still too narrow. So they said, what if you did one on the whole county? And so I did, and they said, yes, this would be a great book. Why don't we do this book? So it took
Not
a little
quite my
back and
tempo
forth.
until we get there. Yes.
Yeah, it took a little bit. And then they gave me about a year and a half. It was an interesting book because it was an issue of balance. Because, as you know, Lorain County is very different. There's the urban places, there's the rural places, there's just so much. I mean, the city of Lorain and the township of, whatever, Pittsfield don't have a whole heck of a lot in common. And so it was an issue of getting a sense of balance of the places, of the eras, of not being just about men, not just being about white people, not just being about, so there was a challenge of getting enough balanced information. So lots of stories that I would have loved to have in it are not, because I think it was a maximum of 35,000 words, which sounds like a lot until you're actually writing it. It's actually a pretty small, relatively small book. So that was the biggest challenge, was actually whittling down what to include to make it as balanced a presentation as I could make it.
So what's some of the reaction that you've had to that book in particular, because it's probably the most broadest audience, certainly for this region. Heard some good feedback, response, solo.
Yeah, I actually got a lot of good feedback. What's funny about it, first of all, people would usually say, but why would you have not included this person? Why would you have not included this place? So that is something that people bring up. Everyone wants their pet stories in it. If I had my druthers, it would add a whole lot more Civil War and Underground Railroad history in it, but that's because that's what I always gravitate towards. So we've all got the things we'd like to have in it. The other thing is kind of funny. When I do in-person presentations specifically about the book, I try really hard to give a caveat saying I am not this all-in-one great historian. There's all kinds of things that happen in Lorain County I know nothing about. I can only speak about what I could speak about. And inevitably I get, well, that one ditch when you're driving down this one road, why is that ditch there? Or, that one house when you're, and there's so many questions people ask me that I'll say, I have no idea. I wish I did.
I know exactly how you feel, because people ask me those kinds of questions about Avon Lake.
Exactly.
I wrote an Arcadia book 10 years ago, and all of that has disappeared out of my head. I have to read the book to remember things.
Yes, you have to reread your own book.
Yes. And so the thing is, too, is that I was dreading the whole time, maybe as you were, oh, why did you forget Granddad's hardware store? Or something like that, because I didn't know. I didn't know.
Yes, right. And even if you knew it, this isn't like a 10,000 or 100,000 word book.
Yes. Can't put everything in there. It's not like those 1890s complete histories of where basically you have to pay to play anyway.
Exactly. And I actually wrote one time a 250,000 word book called The Encyclopedia of Extreme Sports. And even then, we cut some dang things out, because you just, even 250,000 words, when you're doing the world, it's not enough.
And then the extreme keeps pushing the envelope, does it not?
It does. My favorite part of that was extreme ironing. I never knew there was a sport called extreme ironing, but people iron at the highest spot in the world. They iron underwater. They iron while riding a bike at a certain speed. So that, for some reason, that one really stuck with me.
I had no idea. That's fascinating.
I hadn't either. Now we got to do that. Maybe that's what your library can do.
Extreme ironing.
Extreme ironing event.
Yes. How ironic that would be.
You do it. I'll call.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, I guess maybe it's like the guy would tightrope across the Niagara Falls and bring a cook stove with them. So you could have like a little thing ironing under the sea. Imagine that. Okay.
Exactly. You might need it.
I love it. I love it. So along the way too, like I said, a lot of it is you are also in demand as a speaker, and you do presentations on different topics. What are some of the things that you most enjoy doing when you have these things?
When I do presentations, I can tell you the presentations that are most in demand are the Boomerang One, because these people just do crazy things. These Boomerang people, I love them. I consider lots of them good friends, even 25, 30 years later, but they're kind of crazy. I mean, they do things that, so for example, the one guy, The second one I wrote about in the newspaper, he didn't even know how to throw boomerangs, but somehow Gary Broadbent, my original boomerang friend, talked him into competing in the national championships, which is foolish, right? But this guy, John, had a black belt in karate, and so he was obviously athletic. I said if it had been a movie, he'd have done really well and all this wonderful music would be playing. Of course, he ended up in last place. He didn't know how to throw a dang boomerang, right? But the next day, it was over, it was done. They had a maximum time aloft competition where you throw a boomerang up as far as you can, get it to ride the thermal. And if you catch it when it comes down, you get a point for every second. He was the guy who had the 17-minute 6 second because he's got a black belt in karate. He could throw really far. The boomerang it hung over the Olentangy River, so he had to tread water. And then it hung over a soccer field when he was covered in green gunk after treading water. And so they had to clear the field of the children because they thought he was nuts. And so these guys are just walking stories, just in their everyday life. If they say to me, hey, guess what I did? I'll guarantee it'll be something like extreme ironing where you would say, what do you mean? You just did that. So the boomerang one, it almost writes itself. Shoeless Joe Jackson is an endless fascination for people. They want to talk about their theories about whether, he threw the series, did he keep the money? I mean, it's just one of those morality tales that never.
Say it and so.
Yeah. I mean, it just never loses its momentum. And I don't know if Betty Lou's still here, but she and I do quite a bit of presentations. She takes the lead, and I'm her sidekick for Grandma Gatewood. The first one was sold through Hike the Appalachian Trail. So she and I do different kind of things together. And the other type of presentation that seems to be an evergreen is people wanting to talk about how can I do what you do? How can I become a freelance writer? So there's all those different permutations of that.
Well, Betty Lou is in attendance still, of course. And why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got in through the back door to documentaries and television and films? And maybe Betty Lou has a lot to say about this.
Yeah. Betty Lou, do you want to start, or do you want me to start? What's that?
Well, Kelly and I had done several other programs together. I'm with Eden Valley Enterprises, and we specialize in historical programs.
Storytelling and
yeah, plays, things like that. And I had hired Kelly several times to do some stories for programs that I was putting together. When Grandma Gatewood came into our crosshairs for the company to put something together, I contacted Kelly to see if she was interested in working with me on it. The program, it started because Emma Gatewood's youngest daughter, Lucy, randomly told me during a conversation that what she really wanted was to either get her mother's diaries published or to have a film made for her, but she had no idea what to do. So I told her I would look around to see about who she could contact to solve those two problems. Well, I got nowhere with trying to locate who would publish diaries. But a friend of mine was a filmmaker that I had worked with on another project. So I contacted him, told him the background about Emma being the first woman to solo through Hike the Trail. And I said, she wants to have a film made. What should I tell her? And he said, tell her we'll do it.
And all that, huh?
And I'm a theater person. I follow directions. I hung up the phone. I called her. I said, we'll do it. And so, of course, I couldn't do that alone. So, of course, I had to rope in Kelly. And we started, the plan was, because we had no idea where this was going to go, we would write a storytelling program to make sure there was enough information to do anything. Then we would write a first-person play to get the character together and use it as the basis for a script for the documentary. So Kelly basically worked on all of those portions. And in the end, we ended up with a documentary using pieces of both programs, and included interviews with other hikers and trail historians and things like that. And since then, the documentary has taken on its own life, and it's been nominated for an Emmy Award, took second place at the Chagrin Film Festival, took special awards for the Independent Film Festival. It's gotten several awards along the way. So I still do the storytelling program regularly. We show the film at anyone who wants to have film. And we're going to actually be doing the play for the DAR in Lorain County in May. So the play itself will actually be represented here in Lorain County for the second time. It opened at French Creek Nature Center. So that's sort of where we are with that. And now Kelly and I are working on a follow-up documentary on the life of Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president in 1872. So, and we did also do a companion book about Grandma Gatewood. We finished the storytelling program about Victoria Woodhull. We have a companion book for that program as well. So we're cranking out books at the same time we're cranking out programs.
It's multimedia. It's growing from one thing to the other.
Yeah.
And just like expanding the scope of the Lorain County book, it's one leads to another, and who knows what will be next with that. So the Victoria Woodhull project, that's gotten held up by pandemic, or it's giving you time to work on it, or?
Oh my God, yeah. Last year, January of 2020, we held a fundraiser for the Woodhull documentary. Strangely enough, over the years since Grandma Gatewood was done, some rules have changed with these organizations that fund documentaries. And the main rule that changed was, in order to apply for a grant to do the documentary, you have to make a baby version of the documentary to show it to them to get money. So we held a fundraiser, raised enough money for the baby documentary. That was in February of 2020. And then immediately everything ground to a halt. So in the process, luckily the storytelling program was done. The book was out there, it's available. So we just recently, you are the first official organization to get the public word on this. We're going to go ahead and do the documentary entirely self-funded. We're going to, because we're just spending too much time and resources to make a baby documentary to raise money for a big documentary. It's getting crazy. And I'm getting older. So there's that. So we're hoping that announcing that we're moving ahead will bring us some additional donations. We're 501c3, because the reality is the bulk of the Grandma Gatewood project was funded by people who gave us less than $100. So
Crowdfunded.
Yeah, we have $20,000 available. We're going to start. If we don't get any more money, we don't get any more money, but we're making every effort to do it on our own.
And we had done quite a few interviews, some pretty cool interviews on film shortly before COVID hit. So we've got quite a bit of footage of different experts, of a family member who's no longer living. So we got a lot of footage. So it's not like we're starting from ground zero, but it halted, and now we're And the other thing is, the original plan was to have it released in 2020 for the 100th anniversary of suffrage. Well, now the whole angle has changed, and so we just met last week trying to brainstorm, what is it then? It's not that. I mean, it's still true, but that can't be the angle of the release. So it's made it more interesting.
Right. So, her story is interesting regardless.
Yeah.
The big thing right now is, once we get the first person part of it put together, and then the interviews that have been done can be put in, and So yeah, it's called low budget film making. But hopefully
We're thrifty and strategic.
that's right.
There's a long history of very good low budget films being made.
There you
So
go.
Yes, that is true. And thank goodness we're not looking to recreate some Civil War battle or
Yeah.
World War II bombing. I mean,
Yeah.
we just need to deal with people who we can put period clothing on.
and talk to each other and do stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All right. Well, thanks very much for all those details, Betty Lou. It's really good to have you on the show this evening.
Surprise.
You got a lot of things to look forward to. That's exciting. Now, you've done
Yeah,
other
it
stuff
is.
you've done other stuff for television just too, haven't you, Kelly? Like some writing, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to do a cable television show, with writers and things like that. I was actually, when my Boomerang book came out, Morning Exchange, with Fred Griffith, they decided to have us on live, and they wanted me to collect these boomerang throwers, and we were going to go out to Edgewater Park and throw boomerangs, so we were going to do that, and Mark Johnson was going to do the weather show, his weather report, while we were doing this boomerang thing. We get there, there's 30-mile-an-hour winds, the remote towers tipping over. I've got some of the best boomerang throwers in the world throwing, and literally the wind was carrying it out over Lake Erie.
With
So on a
God as
commercial
my
break,
witness, I
Yes.
could swear that boomerangs could fly.
well, let me tell you, this one flew. They would like be gone. And so on a commercial break, because again, this is all live, Mark Johnson says, well, this isn't working very well. When we come back, you're going to teach me how to throw boomerangs. And I said, I don't know how to throw boomerangs. No one ever asked me. I wrote a book, right? So he's like, well, what are we going to do? So we came up with this idea that one of the boomerang guys would be off camera, toss it to Mark, he would catch it, toss it to another guy, and say, look, just during a commercial break, Kelly taught me how to throw, which was totally not true, but we were desperate.
That's television.
Yes, that's live television. It is what it is. And all of a sudden, Mark turned to me to say something about how windy it was. He forgot what we were doing, and the boomerang hit him right in the bridge of the nose on live television. You could actually hear the thunk. I mean, it was like, and he was brave, but it was obvious that he was hurt. So they cut in to have Fred talk about strawberries. I don't know if that was something that was planned or if Fred just talked about strawberries. And Mark started stomping his foot and swearing and saying it really hurt. And they put some makeup on him. And then we came back and just kind of did it. Well, thank you so much for, learning about boomerangs. And the next day, I didn't even turn on the television. I was kind of mortified. But Gary Broadbent did. And he said there was a purple stripe and a black stripe on Mark's nose. And he said, anyone who saw me yesterday saw the first day and the last day of my boomerang, career. So it went really badly. And then I would use that when I would speak at writers' conferences. I would say, sometimes you just got to keep going. Not everything's going to go perfectly. And I would just use it as a rah, rah, go team, go. And it worked really well, I thought. And one time I was at a conference, this lady raised her hand and she says, oh, I saw that show and it was every bit as bad as you're telling us. Oh, yeah.
We all have our share of adventures that didn't quite go the way we planned. Huh?
Not quite the way we planned. Yeah. So that was another television adventure.
All right. One other thing you just told me about, is that you're very interested in poetry and you've just published some poems.
Yes. It's called Speak the Name. And I love writing poetry that incorporates history writing. And so it gives me an opportunity to take a look at someone in history and write something where I'm not bound to the facts the way I am. Obviously, when I'm writing books that you're going to carry in your library, you don't want me, just imagining what they might be like. So, for example, the man who wrote the song Lorena during the Civil War, it's such a haunting song that Confederate officers were saying, don't play it because our boys get so sad for their sweethearts, they leave, they run away. And I wanted to find out who this man was. It ends up, it was an Ohio minister who fell in love with a woman, and her name was not Lorena. I'm trying to think what her real name even was. But he fell madly in love with her. She was a parishioner of his, but her parents had higher aspirations, and she ended up marrying a judge or someone with much more money than he had. But he wrote this song, but then went ahead and married another woman, and they had children together, and she was, I guess, a good minister's wife. So in my poem, I kind of explored what would it feel like to be this woman who, your minister wife, who's supposed to be whatever, is writing a song longing for this woman who got away, and people all around the country listen to it, and it makes them think of their sweethearts. So I would take enough of the history, and I would put a paragraph or two about what really happened or why I became interested. But then I would write about, and actually, in one time he wanted to make it the poem, he was going to title it Bertha. He decided it wasn't as lyrical as Lorena. So just facts like that, and then I read a poem about what it must have been like to be that man, to be that minister, and to be his wife, trying to be this good minister's wife, while people all across the country knew about the one who got away.
Okay, well, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
There's some stories behind everything. Now, I would like to open this up to anybody who's in attendance. If you have any questions for Kelly, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Well, I didn't know Megan was here. Megan is my good buddy from high school. I didn't even know she was here.
Okay, so
Yes,
Megan, or
not to put you on the spot, Megan, but
also to put somebody else on the
and
spot.
Monica, my Twitter buddy, Monica. I met Monica on Twitter a couple of years ago. We became buddies.
And Monica as well is an Avon Lake author and a poet who will be joining us August 24th on this program as well. So I'm glad that she's here tonight to help contribute to the cause. So yeah, anybody got questions for Kelly? Ask away.
I'm trying to think of something. I'm just so interested in listening to you. I can't think of anything to ask you. Your history is so different from mine as far as what you write and everything, although we both love history. Yeah, I was just really interested in your whole presentation. I got started in writing late too, so it's kind of funny that I didn't dream about writing either until I was older. I thought I was weird that way, but I guess you're the same way. So
I don't think we were told that we could do anything other than be journalists for a newspaper then. I think it was, if you wanted to be a writer, that's what you did.
yeah,
And I don't think that, and maybe that is what most people did. I guess I don't know. So nowadays, I think there's a lot more options. The whole freelance concept flow with my counselor.
Content creation.
Yeah, and I mean that just wasn't. Now there's degrees that you can go content whatever. I guess I don't even know what it's called, but you can get a degree in something.
Kelly, what was your favorite topic that of all these books and things that you've written? Was there one particular one that you really liked a lot?
Everything. I will tell you that out of the hidden history book, if I were to write a follow-up book, there was a man who fought. He was from Illyria, and he fought in the Civil War. And there's all these stories about how he was so brave that he fought all these men, even though all his men died. He stayed and kept fighting, and so the Confederates let him walk away as a tribute to his bravery. A lot of that stuff's probably a bunch of hooey, but he obviously was well known in the Civil War. What does he do? But while it's still going on, he meets a priest who tries to tell him killing people is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Not only did he leave, he ended up going to become a priest himself. And then he went and took care of Confederate soldiers and officers who were ill with yellow fever. He dies of yellow fever. So first of all, he tries killing the Confederates and was obviously pretty successful at it, from what I can see. And then he ends up leaving for the priesthood and then dies trying to save the people he had spent all this time trying to kill. He's from Illyria, and I thought that would just be fascinating. And I guess a lot of his papers from his priesthood years and his education years are available. I don't know early life. His mom kind of gave him away when she remarried, and someone else took him in, and a family member or a family friend or something. He wasn't like thrown out to the woods or anything, but I don't know how much of his early life would be there. But I've thought that man deserves something more than what he's got.
Yeah.
So that's one of them.
Anybody else got any comments, questions? Well, I must say that you've given voice to a lot of stories that deserve to be heard. You got them heard, whether it was a funeral home cat or or boomerang champions the world over, or like I said, some of the other stories that you've been part of telling, along with lots of stories about water towers and navigation and things.
And Bud.
So I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us tonight, Kelly, and sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody else who joined us to become part of this conversation. And we'll keep tuned for the rest of the series coming this summer, Tuesday nights, same URL, same time. Read, Write Local, Unbound. This has been Jerry Vogel from Avon Lake Public Library with my guest Kelly. Have a good evening, everybody.